Great. Yeah, thanks, Eli. Hi, everyone. David Ruff, work with Nature Conservancy down in Southeast Minnesota. And so I'm going to, try to talk a little bit about some things going on down here that I think are pretty cool. And I get a fun perspective on this because I'm coming from the nonprofit world, which means that whereas, there's been a lot of really good discussion today on sort of, how do we figure things out when the forester and the wildlife manager walk out onto the stand and are discussing the silvicultural prescription and things like that. I really just get to partner with everyone, which is a fun job to have and a fun perspective to have. And so I'm going to talk about, what some of this forestry and wildlife partnership looks like when you're doing it just kind of working with everyone together at once. Don't have to get into any little interdivisional turf battles, which I'm sure never exist. And just kind of think about, how do we really manage for a diverse, resilient landscape? And I'm going to try to do that in 15 minutes, but I'm also going to give up a few minutes here just because I think a lot of people on this call typically spend most of their time and most of their thought on land kind of north and east of 94, giving just a really quick orientation kind of to Southeast Minnesota. This is not my best map ever, but this kind of shows a couple, when I just think of what Southeast Minnesota is and how I define it, the first thing is I often think in terms of watersheds. So I usually go with kind of 4 real Southeast Minnesota watersheds. Those are from south to north, the Root River, the Whitewater, the Zumbro, and the Cannon. And then also you see there are some little, we call them butterfly watersheds, which consist of the small single stream tributaries that flow straight into the Mississippi there. There's also, within the ecological classification system, you can kind of think of it as being basically the Paleozoic plateau. And that's really tied in with the fact that this is also the driftless area. So this is, the part of the state that in the last glaciation, the glaciers missed. We've got about 300,000 some odd years of a head start developing our stream networks. And those stream networks developed cutting down through a limestone cap, which makes up that Rochester Plateau. So we've got, bedrock that's interbedded shale and limestone, which if you like geology, you might recognize as being essentially a karst landscape. We've got cool sinkholes, springs, features like that I don't have time to get into, but are really neat. They give us cold water aquatic communities with trout in them. And then that longer term development really creates this rugged landscape where you have deeply incised stream valleys that have cut down through that plateau over 300,000 years where we haven't had glaciation. Winding and undulating, it makes thinking about it in a landscape context actually really helpful for orienting yourself when you're out there, because so much of the way things move on the landscape depends on which way water's flowing, because it's not, it's such a linear network without a lot of lakes. The other cool thing when you put this topography down right smack dab in the middle of the prairie forest border, you get these habitat communities in this landscape that is really diverse and really intermixed, right? So southwest facing slopes on sandy soils, you have a really dry community. It's a dry shortgrass prairie. Go over the hill on a northeast facing slope, maybe sheltered in kind of a valley or a coulee, and you're surrounded by white oak, maple, and basswood. So you can walk up a hill ecologically in western Nebraska and walk down the other side in central Ohio. It's kind of cool. And that diversity really makes it we expect it to be a really resilient landscape in the future. This has been reinforced by some science TNC has done recently. Some of you may have heard of. We've been trumpeting it a lot recently. But that's also, when I think of sort of landscape scale wildlife management in Southeast Minnesota, that's really what we're trying to preserve, is that complex mosaic of the different habitat types that are going to make this a resilient landscape in the long run. And how we do that, that condition was mediated for a long time by site conditions. So sandy soils, slope aspect, also by fire, and fire that we've really removed from the landscape over the last 80 or 100 years. that's let invasive species really go nuts. So the fact that Steve described, having buckthorn scattered here and there in a couple spots around the county made me wistful. It is ubiquitous across southeast Minnesota, and when you're trying to protect open areas like bluff prairies or prairies in general, much of which have already been converted to agriculture, and especially those savanna communities, which are, in the absence of fire, really vulnerable to encroachment from shrubs. Those invasive shrubs get just really nefarious. Fire is a pretty big keystone for that, right? There's a lot of debate about is fire an end in itself or is it a tool? Fundamentally, I think it's a tool, but we also have to recognize it's part of climate, and that fire suppression for 100 years has actually been a form of climate change that, we have a chance to reverse to help ourselves get through this other larger, even worse form of climate change that we're beginning the first phases of having to adapt to right now. And so all that feeds into kind of maintaining those prairies and savannas that we've lost so much of to keep that diverse matrix of habitat communities. And then, of course, all of that plays into watershed protection and stopping erosion, protecting water quality in a landscape where it has been heavily converted to agriculture, especially up on that upland plateau that's where you start to see some of those flat, black, and square properties. When most streams form in a grassed waterway in a field, you need to be really careful about what happens as they hit those steep slopes and start forming larger stream systems. And erosion is obviously a concern. Keeping natural communities on, the A, really sandy soils, and B, just the steepest parts of the landscape is really important for preventing the kind of catastrophic erosion that we saw in the turn of the century, 1920s, 30s. And that really led to the first instances of landscape or of watershed planning and watershed sediment budgets that happened. Coon Creek in Wisconsin is just over the river. It's also a landscape that is predominantly privately owned. So, again, in contrast to Aiken County, we are, I think, 93% privately owned. And if you ignore the cropland and only count forest land, it's still 85% privately owned. So how do you do this kind of management to maintain that shifting mosaic of diverse habitats on a landscape when you you only own, or when you only have direct access to 7% of it or so? Some of that obviously is you have to work with private landowners. And so thank goodness for soil and water conservation districts, and especially a huge shout out to the PFM, CFM foresters who do great work. But that's no substitute for the kind of really direct action that ecological professionals can take on state lands. And so that really means prioritizing is important, right? And so in Southeast, we've really done that through the landscape stewardship planning process first, working within the Southeast Landscape Committee of the Minnesota Forest Resource Council. The Root River was kind of the first one of these we did. And what's been most useful about that plan has really been the way that we took a look at the spots where we saw both the importance and the opportunity to really get it right. Ignoring which division owned the land, but just here is where we have an opportunity to work, and here is also where the ecological resources are the most critical in terms of biodiversity, in terms of connectivity. This is where we need to be working together and on the same page. And that's been really helpful because I can barely keep track of my job, right? If I have to keep track of all of someone else's job to stay perfectly coordinated on all this kind of stuff, it's never going to happen. But if I know that just in a few key spots, I need to be making sure that my decisions are going to fit with the goals of, the forester for that region or the wildlife area manager, that's a lot easier to do. And it also makes it easier to kind of plan, other external projects beyond the sort of day-to-day management of timber sales and that kind of thing. And what it's turned into is something that's really kind of grown up organically. And it actually started, I know I've been talking about a landscape approach, but it really started taking shape in something geared towards single species habitat, and that's single species with timber rattlesnake, which depends a lot on these bluff prairies that I've kind of mentioned are some of the most threatened habitats left. And the non-game program actually was really critical in taking a really active role, seeking funding, getting competitive state wildlife grants to go in, cut encroaching red cedar off these bluff prairies, open them back up, and restore a lot of these, critical kind of degraded communities into good, diverse patches of prairie scattered throughout the landscape on those bluffs that kind of shift around. And to do so, they had to work a lot on state forest lands. And it worked well with state forestry because, let's face it, you're not going to grow a large walnut tree on a bluff prairie. It's just not going to happen. And so there was a natural synergy that happened there. Since then, and also since more funding came along, the Nature Conservancy was able to get funding to start helping out and partnering with the non-game program and forestry and wildlife to clear off more bluff prairies. And that's just grown into funding more projects as we've kind of shifted into looking at the woods surrounding those areas, the kind of connective fabric of the woods around it. We're doing, so now we have active projects doing invasive species removal. The bottom map there is a site of a sort of degraded white oak stand that really needed a boost. So we cleared out invasive species to try to get some regeneration going, did some underplanting there. We've done a lot of broadcast seeding to reforest ag fields in especially riparian areas or floodplains, which helps a lot with that watershed protection piece. And then also, after clearing the bluff prairies, of course, then you have to manage a huge flush of brush that often comes up, after that first entry into these degraded systems. And a tool we found really helpful there has been goat grazing. And what's been great is as we've started grazing the bluffs, we've been able to expand those paddocks and get into the woods around them to restore some of the savanna communities. We've seen timber sales right next door where we've been able to let the goats get into the timber sale in advance, and they've knocked down the buckthorn before the oaks get harvested. So we have found a lot of really good kind of synergies in that sense. And also goats make for great pictures, so that helps too. And then the other thing that we've been doing, and this is fun too, is just straight up adding more state land. So the Nature Conservancy with Minnesota Land Trust and Trust for Public Land has been getting started SAM's funding to work with DNR to do more habitat protection, which Southeast Minnesota really needs. I mentioned how privately owned it is, or how little public land it is. This is the biodiversity hotspot of Minnesota. We've got more species of greatest conservation need than any other subsection in the Blufflands. 51% of the plant species that are found in Minnesota can be found in Southeast Minnesota. And yet it's like 7-8% in public ownership. So I'm not saying we're trying to buy the whole landscape, but to me, it's underprotected in that sense. And so that's something we've been trying to address. And we've been able to pick up some really large blocks that are close enough to pre-existing large blocks where you can start to see little stepping stones of refugia, where we can do kind of intensive habitat management like that, where you start getting these, sort of almost like pearls on a necklace of high quality protected lands connected through the matrix of privately owned forest land on these linear bluff features. And you can start to see how you can build out a resilient landscape in that sense. So in the end, just kind of, and this is probably what I should have spent more time on, but the things that have really made these partnerships work, I just put some jotted notes down, but also, I'll kind of riff a little bit. But again, the alignment is key. And I think that landscape focus really helps with that alignment, right? You can have conflicts where at a certain point you go into a stand and a forester is seeing over-mature declining oak forests and a wildlife manager is seeing great habitat producing mast and generating cavity trees. And, that's always going to be a conflict. In terms of which one should be prioritized where, when you can step back and see, well, is this a place we've identified as being really critical to the resilience of the overall ecological community in this spot? You know, maybe we need to be worrying more about the wildlife. If not, then, hey, you got to get the timber somewhere, right? And we got to feed the mills. Having everyone kind of agree on those landscape principles in advance, I think makes those conversations a lot easier to have in the field. It also, you know, to be honest, it helps to be working in a place where your biggest, most important priorities are doing habitat restoration on communities that are never going to be significant revenue producers from a timber standpoint either. And that's just a kind of lucky coincidence of the landscape. And then, you know, funding matters too, right? So I talked a little bit about ways we found funding to do these projects. When you have sort of proactive projects for habitat management that have a funding source, especially one that can be flexible and used on different ownership types, it really makes this whole thing a lot easier. You know, you can't work together if you don't have the resources to do work in the first place. And all of that, again, is easier to get when you've sat down and had those discussions to do that kind of planning in the first place, that landscape scale planning where you set priorities and made sure that they were known priorities by the funders in advance. And so that it all kind of feeds into itself. And how am I doing on time, Eli?
I was just about to interrupt. If you could wrap up in the next couple minutes, that'd be good. We got a bunch of really nice, really good questions coming in too.
Okay, I've been mostly riffing at this point, so I can. That's what this presentation basically turned into, and so I can just kind of stop myself there.